Today we'll have a look at the process using the products that we together call the Nonprofit Package. So this includes advanced projects. It also includes fund management. There is prime time and subcontract management in here, and also a bit of work planning. And together, this creates an end-to-end process. We'll not look at all the different details. There's a lot more behind it. I'll try to get through this in about a little more than half an hour. And if you're interested in some more details on some of the topics, we do have more deep dives in each of the areas. They can be found on YouTube as well. Without further ado, let's go into it. I'm logged into Business Central. I'm logged in a role center where I can perform the different functions we will see today. In this role center, I see a lot of different things. Different users will have different role centers, and I have role centers for most of the different things that a user could do. But of course, in a real world scenario, different users would have their own role centers with only the things that they need to focus on. Before we start, let's get some fundamentals in place when it comes to fund management. When we're talking about fund management, there are some things we will work on today. I will divide it into a couple of different areas. An important point here is that everything is inside of Business Central. There is no external system. You're not supposed to go out and do something in some system, something in another. No, we combine it. It is an all-in-one solution. Particularly what we will be looking at today is three components. It is the funders and funds, and that is captured in what we call a fund ledger. We'll be looking at the project side of things, which we capture in a project ledger, and we will touch upon the finance side of it, which we capture in the general ledger. But this is one of the important parts, and what makes our solution a little bit different than other solutions is that we separate out these parts. They are, of course, connected, but part of what we do needs to be separated out to make it easier to report on. Starting with funders and funds, we can have a look at what goes into that. We will have different funders that will provide funds. The money that they provide goes into different funds. That could be one-to-one, in that one funder provides money into a specific fund, or it could be funds that are more program specific, a fund for water, a fund for relief work. There are different ways we could do it. And so when we look at this, we get the funders and they create what we call a commitment. That could be a grant, it could be money given upfront, could be different rules related to it, different restrictions. These monies can only be used for certain purposes, etc. And they will go into funds. Maybe one commitment is split up into multiple parts, etc. And there can also be rules about when the money can be used, a start date, an expiry date, etc. But this is how we cover that. From there on, we need to start looking at the project where we have a budget, and this is the budget that we will fund with our fund solution. I will come back to this one a little bit later, but these are the starting points. We need to look at funders, their commitments into funds, and we need to have a project with a budget that we can fund. And so I will get back to Business Central, and we will have a look at what this looks like in practice. In the system, we have a list of funders. My list of funders here are two organizations, a Datum Corporation and Trade Research. From a finance perspective, these are also treated as what we would call customers in Business Central, meaning we can have accounts receivable ledger for them. We can track how much money they have paid. If they owe us money, there can be relations, there can be co-work, etc. We just designate them as funders because these are the companies that give us money. The next step is the funds. So we set up different funds that the monies are put into. In my scenario here, I have a couple of them. I have one for public donations, and I have one that is specific to a Datum Corporation, so their funds can go specifically into that fund. And I have some that are program specific, one for water and one for relief programs, and there could be many more. And there can be restrictions on these funds. There could be a restriction on the water program that it can only be used to fund projects that are related to water, etc. So you can set up those rules. For each of the funds, we will see how much money is committed. We can also see, and we will get to that later, how much money of that is reserved for different projects, how much money have actually been used, and of course, lastly, how much of that money have we received as cash. In the case of public donations, we get most of that directly as cash, which is why we have received a lot. For the Datum Corporation, we have a substantial amount committed, and we actually reserved and used it, but we haven't received it yet. And so we are separating out the receiving of the grant from the actual receipt of the money for that. So how do we actually get a commitment? Well, the commitment we get with a document called a fund commitment. I'll create a new fund commitment, and I will create it for a funder from my list of funders, in this case, a Datum Corporation. I'll put a date on it. There could also be a general expiry date, and there could be an external document number, some kind of reference to a document that we are getting. And if it is backed by a physical document, a grant agreement as such, we could put that under the attachments. And of course, we can also add notes to this fund commitment. But we need to put in the actual details. What are the amounts and what funds are we putting it into? In this case, I could put it into the Datum fund. And again, I could give it a description. Maybe again, there is some reference number in here, and I'll put in an amount. Let's say we get 15,000. There can be an effective date. When can we use that money? Let's say we could use that from January 1st of this year until maybe the end of the year, or maybe there is no expiry. There doesn't have to be an expiry, but there can be an expiry date. And the effective and expiry dates becomes interesting later when we start using the money, in that it controls that we don't use money outside that allowed date range. With this in place, I can post this document. And there's no posted fund commitment document. This is a basis. This also creates a number of ledger entries in our fund ledger. Just as I mentioned before, we're tracking this on the fund ledger. So this has no impact on the finances so far. This is just them committing to give money at some point in time. We can have a look at those ledger entries. In this case, there was one ledger entry created, which of course was for the Datum fund to the amount of 15,000. So just as expected, and we haven't received any of that money yet. So far, we have fund and funder, and we have the commitments as well. Now we can start looking at the actual project and budget. We need to spend that money on something. Now, we might have had this project before we got the grant. In this case, it was more of an open-ended grant. You can spend it on different projects. You don't need to have the project, or maybe we said we know what the project is with, but we haven't created in the system before we know that we will actually get the grant. And so I need to create a project in here. I'll create a project with a quick project guide. From here, I can give it a name. Let's call this a Datum project. I will use a template to create this project. I have different kinds of templates for different kinds of projects. They could be funded in different ways, and in this case, I'll use my standard template. I can also select what is here called a customer. Basically, that is usually the main funder of the project, but that doesn't have to be a main funder. It could be something that is funded by multiple entities, and in that case, we wouldn't need it. In this case, I'll just put on a Datum Corporation because it is funded by a Datum Corporation. I'll also designate a project manager, and the project manager will get special rights on this project to manage it and plan it. And he can, of course, delegate those permissions to other people in the organization. In the project plan for the project that I have created, I get a project structure, a work breakdown. In my case, it is a very straightforward linear process with some feasibility, procurement, delivery, and documentation. So this is more of we're going to build something kind of projects. But of course, different projects would have different project structures, and they could be much more complicated with multiple phases and parts, etc. We can also put some additional information in here related to the project. That could be extra attributes, so extra information. It could be events, something that happens. It could be a certain deadline that we need to be aware of. And we put that in here and give it a date. So let's say something happens on the 30th of this month, and that is now in our planning. We need to be aware of this deadline. I could also create a project team designating who is working in what capacity on this project. Let's move over to looking at the actual planning of this project. From within here, I can create a high-level plan using a Gantt chart. And because I used a template, I get a standard structure of this. As I mentioned, this was a very straightforward linear project with different parts. And my template actually includes some standard timing on this. How long would such a phase take in a standard project? And for this very small demo project, we said that the procurement takes a couple of days, and after that we can start delivery to the site, and then we can document in the end. And of course I can move this out and say this is absolutely not enough time, so I simply move it, and that changes the whole plan. So I can adjust this accordingly. And I see my deadline that I put in here. Now I don't know what this deadline is, but at least it's here for reference. And I can save this out as a PDF should I want to. and share it either within the team or with other people. I can also use this later on as a dashboard where we can see as we start to budget for this and incur costs, how much we have actually completed, how we're tracking against that budget and plan. I have a project, I have a plan, now I need to put some numbers on it. That means creating a budget. I can create a budget in multiple ways. I could copy the budget from an existing project, I could use different formulas to calculate it, I could import it from Excel if I had a prepared budget there. In this case, I will create a very simple budget directly in here, and I will budget on the level of resource groups. So for my project, I will use consultants, and consultants, of course, have a standard cost. This is what will be the basis for the funding that we need. And so I will put some time on this. We could say that for feasibility, we need, let's say, 8 hours of time. And for procurement, we need 24 hours of time. And delivery, we need 40 hours of time. And then 5 hours of time to document. We're just putting in some numbers here. This is the budget. So in total, we will spend 77 hours. We can, of course, view this as an amount instead because we have our standard rates for the different people we're using. And so this converts into a monetary budget as well. And we can always go back and forth. I could also budget for other costs. So there could be other expenses. That could be physical goods, items, and I could put that in the budget. But here we'll keep it simple and make it only a time budget. So with this, I have my total budget for the project. And this will be the basis for what I will fund. Before we start working, I need to secure the funding. And for that, I can work with fund allocations. And let's actually have a look at the different projects I have. And this is now my final project in the list. And then I can open up my fund allocation and I can decide how am I going to fund it. If you're a bit observant, you might realize that this is not the number that I had in my budget. I had 4,200, now I have 5,300. Why the discrepancy? Well, that's because I put in a rule saying we need to add some overheads to this. And so I have a setup for overhead costs that are tracking on top of this from a budgetary perspective. We might later want to allocate actual overheads, but at this point, from budgeting perspective, we cannot just go with the resource cost. We want to add overhead for the rest of the organization and thus the higher value here. So 5,390 is what we need to find. This is what we have in the budget. I can write this up or write this down, so I can overwrite this if I want to. It's a setting if we allow it. And then now I can do my breakdown. Where will we find this money? And I do this here below in the fund reservation lines. I can decide to take this from a specific fund. In this case, I might take money from the Datum Corporation Fund. And I can either say, let's just take money out of this fund from any available commitment. Or I can be more specific and say, I specifically want to use this last commitment that we got for 15,000. This is where we should take the money. So I can decide how specific I want to be. Then I decide how am I going to allocate against this? Should this be amount-based or percentage-based? And this becomes interesting if the budget changes. I could say percentage-based and say I want to cover 80% of the budget with funds from a Datum Corporation. That is what they have agreed to. And for the rest, I need to cover that with public donations. So again, percent, and I'll take 20% as public donations. That will fund the last part. Because I chose the reservation method of percentage, if the budget grows, it will not automatically do it for me, but it will suggest me to increase the amounts needed for this and reserved to this project. I could go by amount and then it will be fixed in place at a certain amount. So now it is suggesting me to reserve 4,312 from the Datum Fund and more than 1,000 from public donations. I want to do this, so I say post reservations. And at this point, this goes into my fund ledger. Getting back to the slide here, I had my funder, I had my commitment that went into a fund. I had my project budget, and now I want to connect those two, and that's what I did, with a reservation where I took the amount on the budget and funded this with money from two different funds, in this case, Fund A and Fund B, being the Datum Fund and the public donation. And of course, that was proportional, in this case, 80-20. now I have a reservation. This money cannot be reserved to another project. It is now earmarked for this project. And if anybody else goes to fund a project, they cannot make a reservation on that specific amount because it's taken out. And this is what we use the fund ledger for, to keep track of those reservations, at least to begin with. So back to my project, I now have the initial steps done, and I have my fund reservations. On my project, I haven't actually started planning my actual work. I have only decided how much do I expect it to cost and make sure that I have coverage for that with my funding. But I should plan my work. And work planning can be done in different ways. It could be on a high level, and I think it depends on what kind of resources you're planning for. I could plan on a high level with resources against their capacity, and I could do that with a resource board. This is the resource board that I have for my company. We can see that I haven't planned that much. Cassie, in this case, is planned to work on some different projects over the time. Claire is planned to work a little bit less. Actually, she's planned to work too much here on the Wednesday. She's planned to work 12 hours. Maybe we can help out with that planning and move this to the next day. I hope that's okay because it is not marked as being fixed in time, so we can help out with that. And Connie has nothing to do, so we have plenty of time here. With this, I can then decide to say, well, we created a budget for this project. Let's actually use this as a basis for our resource planning. I will import the entries I have in my budget, and it says 4 work assignments were created. And I can now see that this item project is showing up here with the feasibility of 8 hours being placed on the group of consultants. But I need to decide which consultant can do the work. Connie has plenty of time. I will assign this to Connie. And now Connie is allocated to this. I could work in different stages and also set a status and say, yeah, I've talked to Connie's manager and he has confirmed that she can work on this. So we can work with statuses as well. And looking at a longer timeline, I can look at this and say, well, we also in the following week have these 3 days of work for procurement. Maybe that could also be done by Connie. Perfect. That fits in well. And so on and so forth, getting out here and saying there's 40 hours of work, but Connie is now fully occupied out here. How does it look when we get into June? Yeah, she's still occupied, but Cassie had plenty of time, so I will assign that to Cassie. And the same with the documentation. Maybe that's back to Connie again. And so this is how I would plan out things, making sure that there is time for everybody. And my resources doesn't have to be employees. It could also be external subcontracted people or people in another organization. I can put anybody in as a resource here and plan for them. This is just to make sure that you are allocating time reasonably and you know that you can do the job. So with that in place, I now have a plan for my resources. If I want to do more detailed work tracking, I can do that as well, because there could be tasks where we want to make sure that this is done in a certain fashion, or we want to track the progress of the work. And so in here, I can create what we call work items. They are pieces of work to be done on a project by some individual and maybe with some additional steps. In this case, I will use a template. I'll use a site survey template here. And I now get a templated setup with some description, and there could also be a checklist of things to do. The important part here is that we are tracking the progress of this. This is marked as being not started, and we can have multiple stages as this goes through. It could be to do, in progress, reviewed, and done, etc. And again, I could have my checklist of things to do. So there could be a step 1, step 2, etc. that we go through. And as the work is done, we are marking these as completed. I can even sub-delegate them to someone else. So the important part here is that we set a date when this should be done by. Let's put it on here. And we can, for planning purposes, say when should it be started, and then I can assign somebody to do the work. In this case, I might assign this to myself. And now it says it would like to send an email, but it cannot find an email because this is a fictitious user. I could at this point say, well, I've actually started this, so I will move this over to in progress. And so this is now showing the in progress work items in here. I know I'm a little bit early with starting delivery before we started the other parts, but bear with me. And that work planning shows up on the role centers of each individual. I can see what I'm assigned to do. I have some overdue work items here, and I probably need to start working on those. So it also gives people a way to track what they should do. I can also look at work items across the company and see this is all we need to do. I could view this as a Kanban board where I see there are definitely some things that should have been completed by now. They're still marked in progress. So we're definitely falling behind on some work. And if I'm breaking this out to who's assigned to it, I can see maybe there is somebody who has more of a problem. Else, it seems in general that everybody is behind here. We could also look at this from a project perspective and see what projects is it. It's definitely a school building project where we have a lot of work to do and we haven't completed it on time. But as we complete it, it could be this was actually completed. I simply drag it over to done, and so it is now completed. And the same for the to-do, the weatherproofing. It should have started a long time ago. As soon as that started, I just drag it over to in progress. And of course, I can reallocate work as well between people in here. So that was a bit of work tracking. Now, project is planned out. We have our budget. We have our funding in place. We planned the resources. We planned the work. Now we need to get to actually tracking the costs that we are incurring on the project. And those costs could be in different kinds. It could be purchases we are making. So there could be a purchase invoicing coming in here. It is from some company. We are buying some, let's say in this case, some books. And we want to make sure that this is tracked to the project. So we put it on that project and we put it on the procurement task. And this is, of course, important because this means that we have costs coming in. And this is what we need to fund. But be aware here, I don't need to look at how the funding is. As a finance person looking at this purchase invoice, I don't need to care about that we are splitting this 80-20 between the two different funds. So I just need to know what project this is related to. That splitting, that happens automatically in the background later on, and we will see how. So we're really separating the work of the funding from the finance, in this case, the accounts payable, and they don't need to know about the funding. But they, of course, need to know what project this is related to. I could post this invoice, and now it goes on as cost to this project. The major part of your cost you will have on a project is, of course, the time spent. And that could either be by internal staff or by subcontractors. If you have internal staff working on this, that could be administrative, could be project management, but it could also be those documenting the project, planning the project, etc. They would need to track their time. And that can be done in different ways. One of the ways is, which I like a lot, is what we call the timer function. I have a small window in here where I'm tracking my time. And it might actually be a little bit easier if I close down my windows here so you can see. This is a window that I have on my desktop. Usually I'm not showing full screen things on my desktop when I'm working, but I can have it up here in the corner and it's out of the way. And here I can see I earlier worked on planning. I did that for 3 hours and 55 minutes. And there's a start-stop button. So I can start this and it'll track more time. And we can see I'm currently in a presentation and I've been that for about half an hour. And this is currently running as well. And this goes into my time tracking. And I can go in here and then I can say, well, what was this planning for? Well, this was for a datum corporation and it was for the datum project and this was admin time. So it goes on here. And the presentation, that's also a datum corporation and a datum project, but this is documentation here. And I don't need to do anything else. This is now time that I have tracked and I can keep adding entries throughout the day. At some point, I will click the Open in BC button to open this up as an overview of what I have put my time on. And we will go into the calendar where I can see all the time that I have tracked. So we can see today I start with tracking some planning and now I'm in a presentation. This is still ongoing, so that's why it's showing in red. I can also see what I tracked on previous days, that I had some morning meeting and strategy planning and whatever I did. And this is the basis for my tracking of my time. I can, of course, make changes to this. If this was started earlier, then I can drag it out, make it longer. I can make new manual entries. Maybe I did something in the morning and I can just put it in there to complete my timesheet. Also note that here I can also select what I did. So again, I could select a work item saying, yeah, this was that site survey I did. Good. It puts it on and it automatically selects a project and task. I just need to know what I worked on and will find that for me. So with this, we now have the basis for a timesheet. We could even go in and put more time on it. I'm kind of done. I need to submit this. Of course, this is not a complete week, but I could also see how many hours I have in the week. And it's basically all I need to do. Let's actually update this. Then I can open up my timesheet. Now, if I don't submit my timesheet, there will, of course, be a reminder sent out to remind me, and I can use that as well. But here, I'll just open up my timesheet. We can see these are all my entries, and I can also see them in kind of a matrix view where I can see how much I worked on the different days on this project. I could also put in time manually. Here I have time for administration, let's say internal meetings or something like that. I can simply go in and say, well, I spend 4 hours in internal meetings, or I spend 8 hours on this day. It doesn't have to be the detailed track, but if you want that detailed tracking, it's there for you. I will then submit my timesheet, and it can go into an approval process, or it can be going directly to the project. In this case, I have an approval process for it, and so I will be sent into timesheet approval to approve that time. I happen to be the project manager for both of these projects, and I can see how much time there is to approve. I could also view this by resource, and I can see that in this case, it is Prakash who have submitted a timesheet for 40.7 hours. That looks like a reasonable timesheet. Of course, I can review the details and reject anything that is not correct. In this case, I will approve all that time. I now have cost incurred on my project based on the time that I have spent. And so we had some time budgeted, and we have now actual cost down here on this delivery part. We've used a significant part of the budget we had for the delivery. So far, so good. Let's say the month has ended. We have so far spent a significant part of the budget, and now we want to make sure that that is tracked back to the funding we have. So getting back to this view, we now have actual costs coming from timesheets or purchase invoices, expenses. We haven't looked at expenses, but it could also be an expense sheet. And that fed into the project. Within the project, that was considered actuals on the project, and that used up a significant portion of the budget. This is where we currently are. Where we want to get to is that we want to attribute this or allocate this to the funding that we decided on. And this is the next step. We reserved a certain amount, and we have now used part of that amount. So we could have a look, and I can do it either from the project. I could also do it from another place, which is probably more appropriate if you're doing this on a month-by-month basis, saying, I want to look at the projects where I have funds allocated. And we can see here that on my Datum projects, I had a budget of 5,390. This was what I reserved. And now I want to track how much I have used. So I will set get usage amount, and I could do it for one project, I could do it for all projects. I want to do that up until a certain date. Now, usually that would be a date in the past, but because I track time this week, we will keep it to the current date, and there will actually be some of that time which I tracked in the future, which I will not cover. So there's a cutoff date, and that's an important point because you want to do this at a certain point in time, usually the end of the month. So I will do this. And now it says the total usage price is 3,510. And again, you're saying, well, that is more than the 2,500 you actually tracked. How come? Again, it is that markup. We are marking up those costs to cover overheads in my scenario. That is one model. The other model is cost reallocation. We'll not look at that today. That looks good. I'm satisfied with it. I could go in and look at the details and see the breakdown, where we can see here that it said, due to this 80-20 proportional split, it is saying cover that total amount, split it into two. 702 will be covered by public donations, and the rest will be covered by this grant. So we're again doing that split. And so I can post this. Again, now it goes to my fund ledger, and we can now see that this usage is posted. And when we say posted, it is again important that we look at the different ledgers we have. Getting back to this view, we saw that we had our actuals, and they were created within the fund ledger. This is what we did now. We now put it on the fund ledger that we actually use that money within the fund ledger. Now there is an option to also bring that back into the finance, and this is what we also did at this point. So these actual use of money, we are posting back into the finance part. So we can track how much money is spent by the different parts of the project on these allocations. And we can do that in the finance part. part of the system. So with that, I'm now through the process. I have done some work and I have tracked some costs. And this is the basis what I will report back to my funder. For this period of time, we tracked costs to the value of 2,808, and this was split up in a certain way. Actually, this is very detailed because we are taking every single cost and breaking it down based on my time entries, where we took a percentage of each of those and say, now we will create an entry in the fund ledger where we can see what proportion of that was funded by a certain funder. So we can go back and give this to the funder and say, these were all the costs that we covered on this, and it was for this period of time. So we can do fund reporting on it. And that brings us to reporting. There's a lot of different ways you can do reporting. You can do it through what we call financial reports. That is a feature of Business Central where you can set up your own reporting. There is also a fund analysis report that I could run. That is an Excel report that is generated. And the upside to the Excel reports is that you can change the layout of those yourself. And so I get a fund report. And there we can see a number of key performance indicators. We can see how much our total commitments are at this point in time. So this is up until the current date. And how much did we receive? How much of what we received is committed? How much are we reserved? Breakdown by different funds, commitments by fund, reserved versus total cost allocated, committed versus received, reserved funding by project, and all these different indicators, even a timeline of when different funds will expire. If there's something where we are close to getting to the end of it, we need to spend that money before it expires. Now we don't have that much with an expiry date. But this is just one of the ways we can do reporting. So end to end, this is a process. The only thing we didn't really cover was receiving the actual cash. And maybe this is where we ended. In this case, let's open up cash receipt journal. This is more of a finance function, but it does tie into the whole flow. So let's say that we received a payment from, again, a Datum corporation for a certain grant. We received a certain amount. And what we can do in here is say when we receive that money, that applies to a certain commitment. We select that from the list and say, here we received money for this commitment. And when we post this, this also goes back into the fund ledger. So we can see that we actually received money for this commitment in particular. This, of course, also goes to the finance part, but we are tracking it in the fund ledger as well. So with this, when I post this, we will see that when I get back to my fund, that we have more money received on this Datum corporation. We have now received the 1,000. This concludes this quick end-to-end walkthrough of the nonprofit package with advanced projects, fund management, and project work. What we didn't cover today was the subcontracting part, but there are videos out on YouTube where you can look at that as well.